The 3 days passed too quickly, and Marcus spent every spare moment studying weapon designs and practicing with the holographic interfaces. But no matter how hard he tried, he could not match the natural abilities of his alien classmates. On the morning of the practicum, he woke before the artificial dawn and sat on the edge of his bed in his small quarters. And he looked at his hands in the dim light and wondered what good they were against beings who could reshape matter with their thoughts. He dressed in his cadet uniform and walked through the quiet corridors of the institute, and his footsteps echoed off the metal walls as he made his way to the assessment chamber on the far side of the station. When he arrived, he found the other cadets already gathered outside the sealed doors, and they stood in clusters based on their species and talked in low voices about strategies and techniques. And Marcus stood alone near the back because Yanara had not yet arrived. Cathvaras noticed him and nudged one of his companions, and they both looked at Marcus and made clicking sounds that he knew were mocking laughter. But he ignored them and kept his face calm. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and Proctor Sevenus emerged from within and regarded the assembled cadets with crystalline eyes that held no emotion. "Enter," the proctor commanded, and the cadets filed into the assessment chamber. Marcus had expected something impressive, a room filled with advanced technology and testing equipment. But instead, he found himself in a bare white space with nothing but ordinary furniture scattered around, chairs and tables and storage containers, the same kind you might find in any common room on the station. The cadets looked at each other in confusion, and even Cathvaras seemed uncertain as his mandibles twitched with surprise. "Today you will demonstrate your readiness for combat," Proctor Sevenus announced, and the crystal being moved to the center of the room where everyone could see. "The rules are simple. You have 1 solar hour to construct a functional weapon, using only the materials in this room and your personal knowledge. Then you will demonstrate the lethality of your creation against combat drones." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Marcus felt his heart sink as he looked around at the ordinary furniture and realized he had no idea how to turn any of it into a weapon. "No prefabricated technology," Sevenus continued. "No outside tools, no assistance from other cadets. Your weapon must be entirely your own creation. You may begin." The cadets scattered immediately, and Marcus watched in amazement as they began to work with confidence and skill. Valkyrie students gathered around the room's environmental controls, and their fingers danced with electromagnetic energy as they pulled apart the systems and harvested components that looked useless to Marcus, but apparently contained everything needed to build pulse emitters. Cathvaras and the other Churix moved to the metal tables, and they bent over the table legs and began to secrete acid from glands in their mouths. And the acid hissed and smoked as it etched intricate patterns into the metal that would somehow turn the legs into shock lances. A massive Gorath cadet simply grabbed a chair in its enormous hands and began bending the metal frame into Arath cadet. Simply grabbed a chair in its enormous hands and began bending the metal frame into Arath's what looked like armored gauntlets, and its incredible strength made the work look effortless. Marcus stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, and panic began to rise in his chest as he realized he had none of these abilities. He could not manipulate electromagnetic fields like the Valkyrie. He could not produce acid like the Churix. He did not have the strength of the Gorath, and he had no idea how to build a pulse weapon from basic components because that knowledge required years of study that he had not had time to complete. The minutes ticked by and Marcus still had not moved, and he could feel the other cadets glancing at him with pity or contempt as they worked on their own creations. And Cathvaras paused in his work to look at Marcus and click his mandibles in obvious amusement. What was he supposed to do? Marcus thought desperately as he looked around the room. What could a human possibly build from chairs and tables that would compete against pulse weapons and shock lances? And then something shifted in his mind, something old and deep that came from a place beyond conscious thought. And he remembered stories his grandfather had told him about the old days on Earth. About hunters who brought down animals 10 times their size with nothing but sharpened sticks. His grandfather had been a soldier. And before that, his great-grandfather had been a soldier. And before that, his family stretched back through generations of warriors who had fought with every weapon imaginable. From rifles to swords to spears to rocks, humans had been making weapons for 300,000 years. And they had started with nothing but their hands and their brains and whatever they could find lying around. Marcus looked at a standard-issue polymer chair that sat nearby. A simple piece of furniture designed for species twice his size with 4 sturdy legs and a solid back. And he walked toward it with a new light in his eyes. He picked up the chair and felt its weight. And it was heavier than it looked, but still light enough to swing. And he tested the strength of the legs by pressing on them and found that they were strong but not unbreakable. The other cadets paid no attention to him as he carried the chair to the nearest wall. And they were too focused on their own complex projects to notice the human in his furniture. Marcus lifted the chair high above his head. And for just a moment, he hesitated as a voice in his mind told him this was crazy and primitive and would never work. Then he slammed the chair against the wall with all his strength. The sound was like a thunderclap in the quiet room, and every head turned to stare as the chair shattered into jagged pieces that scattered across the floor. Marcus ignored their stares and knelt down to examine the debris. And he found exactly what he was looking for. The back leg of the chair had broken at an angle that left it with a wicked point. A natural spear tip created by the splintering of the polymer material. He picked it up and tested its weight. And it felt good in his hand, balanced and solid. And the point was sharp enough to pierce flesh or find the gaps in armor. "Done," he said. And his voice was calm, even though his heart was racing. The room was silent as every alien in the chamber stared at him. And Kefvaras made a sound of disbelief and said, "That is not a weapon, that is debris. That is garbage." Even Yanara, who had arrived during his work and stood near the door, looked uncertain as she stared at the broken chair leg in his hand. But Marcus just smiled and began to work on improving his creation, because he was not done yet. Not even close. His ancestors had not stopped at the first sharp stick they found, and neither would he. The Galactic Institute of Integrated Defense Studies hung in the void of space like a metal flower with 1,000 petals. And inside its gleaming halls walked creatures from 100 different worlds, but only one of them was human. Marcus Cole stood at the back of the nanofabrication laboratory and watched his classmates work with machines he barely understood. And he felt the familiar sting of being the outsider, the primitive, the creature from the young species that had only discovered faster than light travel 60 years ago. The Valkyrie students moved their long silver fingers over the holographic controls, and pale blue light danced between their palms as they used their natural electromagnetic fields to shape molecules into weapons, and looked like magic to Marcus, even though he knew it was just biology. Beside them, the Churiks worked in pairs, their forearms moving in perfect harmony as they calibrated plasma forges with a speed and precision that made Marcus feel slow and clumsy. And their hard black eyes never seemed to blink as they focused on their creations. Marcus looked down at his own workstation, where a half-finished project sat in pieces. And he tried again to manipulate the holographic interface, but his human fingers kept triggering the wrong commands because the system was designed for species with different brain patterns. "Cadet Cole," a voice rang out like crystal striking crystal. And Marcus looked up to see Proctor Sevenus gliding toward him. The Proctor was a Crithian, a being made of living mineral that stood 8 feet tall and reflected light in patterns that hurt human eyes. And when Sevenus spoke, it was with a tone that carried neither warmth nor cruelty, but something worse. Disappointment. Your progress remains inadequate. Sevenus said, examining the mess on Marcus's workstation. Though I suppose it is adequate for a Death Worlder. Marcus felt his face grow hot, but he kept his voice steady and said, I am still learning the interface, Proctor. Indeed, Sevenus replied. And the word carried the weight of 1,000 judgments before the crystalline being moved on to inspect other students. Marcus let out a breath he did not know he had been holding, and he returned to his work with hands that wanted to shake, but he would not let them. Humanity was new to the galaxy and still on probation with the Galactic Concord. And every human who left Earth carried the burden of proving that their species deserved a place among the stars. And Marcus felt that burden every single day in this place where he was surrounded by beings who saw him as little more than a clever animal. When the class ended, Marcus gathered his things and walked into the corridor where the ceiling rose 50 feet above his head, and the walls displayed shifting images of famous battles from galactic history. And he felt very small beneath all that ancient glory. Marcus, wait. He turned to see Yanara hurrying toward him, her silver skin catching the light and her electromagnetic field making the air around her shimmer faintly. And she was the only one in his cohort who treated him like an equal rather than a curiosity. You look troubled, she said when she reached him, and her large dark eyes studied his face with genuine concern. Just another day of being reminded that I do not belong here, Marcus said with a tired smile. Inara fell into step beside him as they walked toward the dining hall. And she was quiet for a moment before she said, the weapons practicum is in 3 days. Marcus felt his stomach tighten at the words because he had been trying not to think about the practicum, the live evaluation that would test every cadet's ability to create and use weapons under pressure. And failure meant expulsion from the institute. I know, he said. It will be your hardest test yet, Inara continued, and her voice was gentle but honest. The other cadets have natural advantages that you lack, and the proctors will not adjust the evaluation for human limitations. I know, Marcus said again, and this time the words came out sharper than he intended. Do not take offense, because she had learned that humans sometimes spoke harshly when they were afraid. And instead she touched his arm briefly and said, I am not trying to discourage you. I am trying to help you prepare. Marcus nodded and forced the tension out of his shoulders. And he said, I appreciate that. I really do. I just need to figure out how to compete against beings who can shoot lightning from their hands or spit acid that melts metal. Humans must have some advantages. Yanara said, your species conquered your entire planet. That is not a small achievement. We did it slowly. Marcus said, over thousands of years. With tools and weapons we built from rocks and sticks and bones, not with biological superpowers. Yanara considered this as they entered the dining hall, a vast chamber where hundreds of cadets from dozens of species ate foods that ranged from raw meat to pure energy to things Marcus could not even identify, and they found a quiet table in the corner away from the crowds. Perhaps that patience is your advantage, Yanara said as she sat down. Before Marcus could respond, a shadow fell over their table, and he looked up to see Kethvaras standing there with 3 other Churix cadets behind him. Kethvaras was the son of a powerful, noble family, and his exoskeleton was decorated with gold inlays that marked his high status. And his mandibles clicked together in what Marcus had learned was the Churix expression of contempt, the human and his pet Velkari, Kethvaras said, and his compound eyes glittered with malice. How touching. What do you want, Kethvaras? Marcus asked, keeping his voice calm. I want nothing from you, mammal. I simply came to offer some advice before the practicum. Kethvaras leaned closer, and his mandibles spread wide in a threatening display. Go home. Withdraw from the evaluation. Spare yourself the humiliation of public failure. I will take my chances. Marcus said Kethvaras made a sound that might have been laughter, and he said, "Your species does not belong among warriors. You are soft and slow and weak. You have no claws and no venom and no natural weapons of any kind. You are prey animals who learn to walk upright. Nothing more." Marcus stood up slowly, and even though Kethvaris was taller and stronger and could probably kill him with one blow, he did not back down, and he said, "Prey animals do not conquer their entire planet." Kethvaris stared at him for a long moment, and then he clicked his mandibles again and said, "Enjoy your final weeks at the Institute, human. They will be your last." The Churix cadets turned and walked away, and Marcus sat back down with his heart pounding in his chest, and Yanara looked at him with something like admiration in her eyes. That was either very brave or very foolish. She said, "Probably both," Marcus admitted, but as he watched Kethvaris disappear into the crowd, he made a silent promise to himself that he would not fail, that he would not let his species down, that he would find a way to prove that humans deserved their place among the stars. He just had no idea how he was going to do it. Marcus picked up a smaller piece of the broken chair and used its sharp edge to scrape the point of his spear even sharper. And the sound of polymer against polymer filled the quiet space around him as the other cadets slowly returned to their own work. He could feel their eyes on him, and he knew they thought he was crazy or desperate or both. But he did not care because he had found something they did not understand, something they had forgotten in all their thousands of years of advanced technology. He tore strips of fabric from the bottom of his uniform jacket and wrapped them around the grip of the spear to give his hands something to hold on to during a fight. And he pulled the wrapping tight and tested it by swinging the weapon through the air. The spear moved smoothly and the balance was good. And Marcus nodded to himself with satisfaction as he looked for more materials to improve his loadout. Found a heavy table leg that had come loose when one of the Garth cadets had stripped the table for parts. And he picked it up and swung it experimentally. And it would serve well as either a club or a shield, depending on how he held it. Yanara approached him slowly, and her silver face was twisted with confusion and concern as she watched him examine his collection of broken furniture. "Marcus," she said in a low voice so the others would not hear, "the assessment requires a functional weapon, something that can demonstrate real lethality against combat drones. That stick will not penetrate their armor." Marcus looked at her and smiled, and there was something in his eyes that she had not seen before, a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. "It does not need to penetrate armor," he said, and he pointed toward the combat drones that waited in their charging alcoves along the far wall. "Look at them. Really look at them, and tell me what you see." Yanara turned to study the drones, and she saw what everyone saw: floating spheres of metal and weapon systems, armored and dangerous and designed to test cadets without killing them. "I see combat drones," she said. "Standard training units with reinforced plating and multiple weapon systems." "Look closer," Marcus said. "Look at the joints where the weapon arms connect to the main body. Look at the sensor array on the front. Look at the cables that run between the armor plates." Yanara looked again, and this time she saw what he was pointing at: small gaps in the design, places where the armor did not quite meet, spaces that allowed the drone to move and see and function. "Every machine has weaknesses," Marcus said. "Every design has assumptions built into it, and every assumption is a gap that can be exploited. Those drones are designed to fight against energy weapons and projectiles. They expect attackers to stand at a distance and shoot at them." He held up his spear and let the point catch the light, and he said, "They are not designed to fight against a human with a sharp stick who gets close enough to touch them." Yanara stared at him for a long moment, and then she asked, "Where did you learn to think like this?" Marcus was quiet as he gathered his thoughts, and then he said, "On my homeworld we have a very long history of violence. We have been killing each other and everything around us for hundreds of thousands of years. And we started with nothing but rocks and sticks. He sat down on a piece of broken furniture, and Yanara sat beside him. And the other cadets continued their work around them as he spoke. My species did not have claws or fangs or venom. Marcus said, "We were not the fastest or the strongest animals on our planet. We were soft and weak and easy to kill. But we survived anyway, and do you know why?" "Tell me," Yanara said. "Because we learned to use tools," Marcus said. "We learned to take the world around us and shape it into weapons. We learned to study our prey and find their weaknesses. And we learned that patience and persistence and intelligence could defeat any enemy, no matter how powerful." He held up the spear again and looked at it with something like reverence. And he said, "This weapon is over 300,000 years old. Humans have been making spears since before we were even fully human. And we used them to hunt animals that were bigger and faster and stronger than us. We drove some of those animals to extinction." He continued, "Not because we were more powerful, but because we never stopped coming. We followed our prey across continents. We hunted them for days and weeks without rest until they collapsed from exhaustion. And then we killed them with sharpened sticks, just like this one." Yanara was silent as she processed his words. And when she spoke, her voice was soft with something that might have been respect or might have been fear. "Your species sounds terrifying," she said. Marcus laughed. And it was not a cruel laugh, but an honest one. And he said, "We are. We really are. And the worst part is that we have forgotten it. We have lived in peace for so long that most humans have forgotten what we are capable of." He stood up and took his position near the testing area. And he said, "But our ancestors have not forgotten. Their knowledge lives in our blood and our bones. And when we need it, we can reach back through the generations and find it waiting for us." Ketferis passed by and looked at Marcus with open contempt. And the Churix noble held up his shock lance that crackled with electrical energy and said, "Enjoy playing with your stick, human. I am sure it will be very impressive when the drones tear you apart." Marcus just smiled and said, "We will see." The hour was almost over, and the cadets began to gather near the testing area with their completed weapons. And Marcus stood among them with nothing but a broken chair leg and a table leg and the knowledge of 300,000 years of human violence. Proctor. Sevenus moved to the front of the group and surveyed the assembled weapons. And the crystal being's eyes lingered on Marcus's spear for a moment longer than the others. "The construction phase is complete," Sevenus announced. "Now we will see which of you has truly created a weapon." Marcus tightened his grip on his spear and felt the fabric wrapping bite into his palm. And he whispered words that his grandfather had taught him long ago. Improvise. Adapt, overcome. The test was about to begin. The assessment chamber fell silent as Proctor Sevenus moved to the center of the room. And the crystal being's form caught the light and scattered it in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. And every cadet turned to listen as their instructor began to speak. "Cadets," Sevenus said. And the proctor's voice rang like a bell in the quiet space. "You were given a simple task today. You were told to build a weapon. And most of you did exactly what was expected of you." The crystal being gestured toward the Volcari, students and their pulse emitters, and then toward Kethvars and his shock lance, and then toward the Goreth with her armored gauntlets. "You built devices," Sevenus continued. "Complex creations that depend on power cells and calibrated systems in specific conditions. Creations that will fail if the power runs out, or if the calibration drifts, or if the conditions change." Sevenus turned to look at Marcus. And the human felt the weight of 1,000 alien eyes upon him as the proctor walked toward where he stood with his spear still in his hand. "Cadet Cole built something different," Sevenus said. "He built a weapon that requires nothing but a human, and the will to use it." The proctor reached out and took the spear from Marcus's hands, and the crystal being examined it carefully, turning it over and studying the sharpened point and the wrapped grip and the balance of the design. This technology is over 300,000 years old, Sevenus said. And there was something in the proctor's voice that sounded almost like respect. It has killed more beings on the human homeworld than any other invention in their history. More than their guns, more than their bombs, more than their nuclear weapons. The cadets stirred and murmured at this. And Marcus saw surprise on faces that had only ever known the humans as primitive newcomers to the galactic stage. This weapon functions in vacuum, Sevenus continued. It functions underwater. It functions in electromagnetic storms that would render your pulse emitters useless. It functions when the power fails and the systems crash and civilization falls apart. The proctor handed the spear back to Marcus and then turned to face Kethvaris. And the Churix noble seemed to shrink under the weight of those crystal eyes. You called this debris, Sevenus said. You mocked the human for his choice of weapon. But tell me, Kethvaris, would your shock lance have worked against Drome 7? Kethvaris hesitated before answering, and his mandibles twitched with uncertainty as he said, Drone 7 was hardened against electrical attacks. My weapon was less effective than I had hoped. Less effective, Sevenus repeated. Your weapon failed because the drone was prepared for it. But was the drone prepared for a sharpened stick? Was it designed to fight against an enemy who would get close enough to touch it and drive a point into its joints? No, Proctor, Kethvaris admitted. And his voice was quiet with something that might have been shame. No, Sevenus agreed, because no one expected it. Because the very idea seems absurd to a civilization that has had energy weapons for 10,000 years. And that assumption, that blind spot, is exactly what makes humans dangerous. The proctor moved to address the entire class again. And Sevenus's crystal form seemed to glow brighter as the being spoke with passion that Marcus had never heard before. The Galactic Concord views humans as newcomers, Sevenus said. Primitives who have only just discovered faster than light travel. Children playing at being warriors in a galaxy of ancient powers. But their homeworld is classified as a Category 12 death world, the proctor continued. A planet where everything evolves to kill everything else. Where the weather alone can destroy cities, and the wildlife considers intelligent beings to be prey. Marcus thought of Earth. Of hurricanes and earthquakes and volcanoes and sharks and tigers and all the other dangers that his species had learned to survive. And he felt a strange pride in coming from such a deadly place. Humans did not survive their homeworld by being the strongest or the fastest or the most gifted, Sevenus said. They survived by being adaptable, by taking whatever they found around them and turning it into a tool for survival. By never giving up no matter how hopeless the situation seemed. The proctor turned to look at Marcus one more time, and the crystal being said, Debris in human hands has conquered worlds, remember that. All of you. The assessment ended, and the cadets began to file out of the chamber. And many of them looked at Marcus with new eyes as they passed him. And some of them even nodded to him with respect that he had not earned before today Kethvaris was the last to leave. And the Churix noble paused at the door and looked back at Marcus with an expression that was hard to read. You have made an enemy today. Human, Kethvaris said, but there was no real threat in his voice. Only a kind of grudging acknowledgement. I know, Marcus said. Humans are good at that too. Kethvaris made a sound that might have been laughter. And then he was Gonianara found Marcus later in the observation deck, sitting alone by a window that looked out at the stars. And his spear lay across his lap as he gazed at the infinite darkness of space. You should be celebrating, she said as she sat down beside him. You passed the assessment. You proved yourself. You earned the respect of the entire cohort. I know, Marcus said. But his voice was quiet and thoughtful. Then why do you look so serious? Yanara asked. Marcus was silent for a long moment. And then he said, "On Earth we have a saying. Improvise, adapt, overcome. It means that no matter what challenges you face, you can always find a way to win, if you are willing to think and change and keep fighting." He looked at her, and his eyes reflected the light of distant stars, and he said, "Most species out here have had starships for thousands of years. They have forgotten what it is like to have nothing but your hands and your brain. They have forgotten what it is like to be desperate and afraid and willing to do anything to survive. Humans have not forgotten," he continued. "That knowledge lives in our blood, and when we need it, we can reach back through the generations and find it waiting for us." Yanara was quiet as she considered his words. And then she asked, "Does that frighten you?" Marcus shook his head and said, "It does not frighten me, but it should probably frighten everyone else." He looked out at the galaxy spread before him. 100,000 worlds and 1,000,000 species and empires older than human existence. And he smiled with the quiet confidence of a predator who has just realized that all these new territories are full of prey. "We are coming," he said softly. "And we have not forgotten how to hunt." Yanara watched him for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that made her shiver. And she understood at last why the galaxy should pay attention to the little species from the deadly world called Earth. Humans were not primitives pretending to be warriors. They were warriors who had only just begun to remember what they truly were, and the galaxy would never be the same.